Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, good to see you again too.
Do you need this open, Mike? Is this a source of heat?
You can close that. Go ahead.
Okay. It's really hot right there. We're the pawn of the video age. So you have to start somewhat on time, even if people aren't here. So you can tell me when you're ready?
We are.
Are you starting?
Yeah, we're already starting.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, I guess I'll start.
By 3 o'clock, I have to leave. It's not that I'm going to be.
Don't worry, I may not even talk that long.
Okay. You know, I don't want to.
You're on the video.
Disagreement with you. Okay.
Well, you may end up in disagreement. You never know. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is a topic that really has been the implied topic of much of the activity of Lyndon LaRouche in the recent months, and then in particular was re-inaugurated with Keisha taking up the issue of reviving NASA. And we had a very successful conference last weekend down by NASA, which activated some people who were in and around the NASA program. But the issue, as I've been saying for some time recently, is that we're not talking about NASA as a nuts and bolts project or an engineering project or a jobs program or anything small on that level. And what Mr. LaRouche has made clear, and Keisha in her activity has been making very clear, is that we're dealing with a change in the conception of human beings. That what a great policy such as the space program in its initial phases in the United States, the moon mission represented, had a certain mission to it, getting to the moon. As Kennedy said, we intend to send a man to the moon and return him safely within this decade. And that set a kind of time frame to it. But there was something much more profound that was in the minds of the pioneers of space, who were the ones who shaped and developed the idea behind the program. So when you go to NASA today and you see the huge Saturn V rocket, and you somewhat marvel at what kind of engineering and electronic engineering and physics and general science went into that. The circuitry itself is mind-boggling. That's not really what we're talking about with NASA. And I think at this moment, when we have a presidential campaign that is so horribly disgusting between opportunists, egomaniacs, lackeys for an empire, who actually, in the last Republican debate, probably hit a new low in world politics, maybe since whichever Roman emperor it was married his horse. You know, when little Marco, as Trump called him, and Trump got into an argument about penis size. You know, that's how far below that can you go? What are they going to do in the next debate? Whip it out and measure it to see who's got the biggest one, and that's going to be president? I mean, it's sad, isn't it, that this is what the debate has become. And that what's missing, and here we have an incredible moment of potential. What Putin did to shift the situation in the Middle East away from endless wars to the possibility of an American-Russian collaboration to defeat terrorism. This was a tremendous shift. And that didn't take place in isolation. And it didn't take place without opposition. It's still opposed by President Obama, who's an agent of the empire that we've been fighting, the British Empire. It also occurred, though, in a much bigger picture of a Chinese-Russian initiative to break out of the collapse of the transatlantic financial system, which is collapsing daily, into a new, you might say, economic system based on the principles of physical economy that are based on the original initiative of Alexander Hamilton with the American Revolution and have been the life's work of Lyndon LaRouche. The replacement of money policies with an idea on physical economy. And physical economy is based on a principle of economic development in productive capability, based on the advance of science and the ability to take scientific discovery and allow for technological innovation, and to develop a workforce which is capable of assimilating these new technologies and turning them into an increase in productivity. That's a profound conception that was underlying Hamilton's reports when he became the first Treasury Secretary under George Washington. The idea that our nation was a unified whole, committed to the economic development of the physical space of our territory, and that would be proven good or bad depending on improvements in the standard of living, which would be determined by an ability to fund real advances in science and technology and manufacturing and agriculture. So this is what we're looking at today. We have an opportunity for that to occur as a result of the Eurasian perspective of the Chinese President Putin and the Indians in particular, but also the efforts to bring the Germans into that, sections of the nations of South and Central America and others who are committed to that kind of policy. Now, what do we see in our country? As I said, we have a presidential campaign that's absurd. You know, the mudslinging that's going on, kindergarten kids would be embarrassed by that.
Yeah, really.
And the whole campaign is a diversion away from this potential reality, this potential for a new paradigm based on the Eurasian perspective, and particularly China. Now, one of the things the Chinese are doing, which is very exciting, is that they're picking up on the mission that we once had in space. To look at space again, not just as a new frontier in the sense that you're going somewhere where you haven't been before, but that's important. That you're making new discoveries all the time, that's important. But that this is defining the nature of man. That we're doing this not for purposes of geopolitics, but as people get involved in the space program, they realize it is a potential for unifying the human race around a higher mission and a higher potential. And so that's what we're looking at. And I want to give you a couple of quotes to begin with of people who were involved in this, one of whom was involved in it before there was really a space program anywhere. A Russian space pioneer named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. And he wrote this in 1895. He said, "The Earth is the cradle of mankind, but one cannot stay in the cradle forever." Something I tell my son all the time. "In all likelihood, the better part of humanity will never perish, but will move from sun to sun as each one dies in succession." This idea of a huge scope or arc of history, where we know our sun is going to burn out at some point. It's not necessarily something that should be on the front burner of politics, but it's going to happen. And we have to be prepared for these kinds of eventualities. But this is in 1895, someone talking about what Kraft Erika, the German space pioneer, called the extraterrestrial imperative. Now here's a quote from just a couple days ago, when Scott Kelly returned from almost a year in the International Space Station. And you know, it's an interesting question of how the medical testing they're going to do. He grew 2 inches while he was in space because of weightlessness. And is he going to stay longer? What's the physiological effect of that? And they're looking at this in conjunction with a twin brother. So they have sort of a control to look at the effects of weightlessness. But what did he say? He said, as to why we go into space, he said, it's in our DNA of our country to explore, And we must never stop doing this. We must lead, we must learn, and we must discover. The idea that the mission in space is to discover something new, not just about the physical universe, because we really don't know that much about the universe outside of us. We know a lot more than we used to, but we still have just begun the exploration. But to discover something as well about the nature of man. What makes us human? What qualities do we possess if we're able to get over fear and corruption, xenophobia, racism, if we can get over the infantile activities of scared people and actually look at all of mankind as our ally and every nation as a potential collaborator in doing good in the universe. And space is a frontier which offers that as a direct impulse. Now, we had some leaders in the past who were able to articulate that kind of vision. And I'm going to be taking a look at the very short presidency of John F. Kennedy and go back a few years before his presidency to make it clear that at that time there was a leader who was able to take that vision and, in spite of enormous pressures, a not very good Democratic Party at that time, a not very sharp Republican Party, the pressures coming from the British Empire for the United States to break fully with the Franklin Roosevelt conception of the four freedoms and the collaboration among nations, that Kennedy courageously stood for these higher principles. Now, everyone here who's from Houston probably is familiar with the famous speech he gave at Rice University in September 1962, but I'll just quote from it because it is a good starting point to look at the conception that he had of what the space program represented. He said, "We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard, or hard, as Betty would say." And he said that because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our abilities and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. Now, this was not an anomaly that Kennedy decided to support the space program. And it was not, as some people say, because we were in a space race with the Russians. That there was an element of that, but as you'll see in this coming minutes, Kennedy was moving away from a Cold War approach. Was actually thinking beyond the post-World War II division of the world into two empires which each possessed nuclear weapons and the adequate weaponry to destroy the human race, not just each other's country, but also a commitment to science so that if the two sides collaborated, there would be a potential to resolve those tensions that were underlying the two empires. Now, again, when I go through this, I want you to think about this today, where we have, because of what Putin initiated last September and October, when he came to the United Nations in September, the end of September, and said, why don't we have cooperation and a real coalition against terrorism? And he offered to the United States that Russia would be a collaborator against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And the condition for this was that the best way to fight them would be to support the government on the ground that was fighting against them. And Obama rejected it. He said, we will not work with you unless you give up Assad. Well, if Assad's government collapses, as US military people knew at the time, that would mean a takeover of ISIS in Damascus, shortly to be followed by a takeover in Beirut and probably Amman, Jordan. Our military knew that. They knew the strategy that Obama had articulated of bombing in the desert, every day to eternity was not going to defeat ISIS. In fact, ISIS expanded their territory under the Obama policy. And at the same time, the Obama policy, which again is, it's giving Obama too much credit to call it the Obama policy. He was the puppet for the people who wanted this war, the same British and Wall Street imperial interests that carved up the Middle East in the first place. It wasn't Wall Street in 1915, but it was the British, the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the other agreements that drew the boundary lines of countries in the Middle East that were so easily fractured by the Cold War division and then by the efforts of regime change of the US administration. Bush in Iraq, Obama in Libya, and Hillary Clinton in Libya, by the way, and then Obama in Syria. So Putin said, no, let's work together. And the Russians moved in and started hitting the terrorists. And at first the US was opposing it, at least Obama was. But the military saw the progress the Russians were making. And they had been itching to have a piece of the action in the real fight. And because of pressures from the military and a section of the intelligence community, not the CIA, because just as Kennedy had to fight the CIA today under Brennan is on the side of the terrorists. The CIA director who's very close to the Saudis. So Putin shifted the situation, and now the Chinese and others, including in Germany, are talking about a development plan for the Middle East. Let's end the hostilities and have development. Well, I want to show you that this, coming from Eurasia, is an echo of what John Kennedy was trying to do with his presidency, and why the fight that we've reinitiated, that Lyndon LaRouche reinitiated and that Keisha has taken the point on, is precisely the fight that Kennedy had to defeat the British Empire. Now, the starting point for this was Kennedy having been a product of the Franklin Roosevelt World War II generation. Roosevelt was a little older than Kennedy, but Kennedy was one of those who was very much moved by that fight and the idea that the collaboration with Russia in the war was created a potential for the future. Now, when Kennedy came back to the United States, Roosevelt had died, and Lyndon LaRouche talks a lot about the effect of Roosevelt's death on the World War II generation. You lost a leader, a father figure almost, who guided the nation through a depression, who took the side of the people against Wall Street, and then rallied the people to fight against the Nazis. Now, it wasn't explicit at that time, but who was it who was on the side of the Nazis? Who helped finance Hitler? The Harriman family and Prescott Bush. Roosevelt's Attorney General seized the bank of Roland Harriman and Prescott Bush in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy Act because they'd been funding Hitler for a decade. There were British networks that were supporting Hitler. This was part of the empire. It wasn't just about Germany, it was about Germany and the Soviet Union having these two countries fight each other, about geopolitics. So Kennedy was inspired by Roosevelt working with Stalin, who was not a great figure, but working with Stalin and then having the idea that perhaps after the war, we can forge an alliance that would be based on the historic relationship of the American people and the Russian people. And FDR never had a chance to do that. And following his death, Harry Truman came in and he was steamrolled by Republicans like Dean Acheson. Or I guess Dean Acheson may have even been a Democrat. And Republicans such as the Dulles brothers. You'll hear a little more about the Dulles brothers because these were two of the more corrupt figures representing Wall Street in the same way that the Bush family represents Wall Street as a junior partner at the time of the British. Now, Kennedy understood the question of Great Britain. And some of the things I'm going to tell you, there's an excellent article from the August 30th, 2013 EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, called John F. Kennedy versus the Empire. And I'm going to take some of the Kennedy quotes from that article. But But what becomes clear is that he understood what the British Empire represented. He was talking about what the people in England saw when the Americans were training there. My father, in fact, was among the Americans who spent almost a year in England in preparation for the Normandy landing on D-Day. Kennedy said, and this was in a speech he made in 1945, he said, England traditionally has been a country with tremendous contrast between the very rich and the very poor. With the coming of the American troops during the war, with their high pay, with their stories of cars, refrigerators, and radios for all, a new spirit, a new restlessness, and a fresh desire for the better things of life had become strong in Britain. But he said, even if the Labour Party were in power in Britain, he said, Britain stands today as Britain has always stood, for the empire. Now, Kennedy, who's usually portrayed as a rich playboy when he was in his first years in the Congress and then as a senator, and some of that is true. He was rich and he was a bit of a playboy. But he was also a very effective spokesman for an anti-colonial policy. And in particular, before he ran for the Senate, after he'd been a congressman for a couple of terms, he did a tour. He toured other places like India. He went to Vietnam. He toured parts of the world that you ordinarily wouldn't find young Americans. And it became clear to him that the U.S. was going in the wrong direction. Now, this was in 1951. He toured Asia and the Middle East. And he gave a radio report back when he returned. And here's what he said. The post-war colonial world is an area in which poverty and sickness and disease are rampant. Injustice and inequality are old and ingrained. The fires of nationalism are now ablaze. Now, many of the Americans thought nationalism was a threat, because it was against the empire. They wanted to kick out the colonial oppressors. He said, for 100 years and more, it has been the source of empire for Western Europe, that is the colonial area, for England and France and Holland. A Middle East command operating without the cooperation and support of the Middle East countries would intensify every anti-Western force now active in the area. Now think about what we're doing since the George W. Bush invasion of Iraq, when you hear these words. It was absolutely prescient what Kennedy said, that if you go in without the support and cooperation of these countries, this would intensify every anti-Western force now active in the area. And from a military standpoint, would be doomed to failure. The very sands of the desert would rise to oppose the imposition of outside control on the destinies of these proud people. Iraq, think about it. Syria. That these countries fight for their nation, and the more we do supposedly to help them, the more angry they become, because you cannot fight this kind of war from the outside. Then he said, the true enemy of the Arab world is poverty and want. Our intervention in behalf of England's oil investments in Iran, directed more at the preservation of interests outside Iran than at Iran's own development. Our failure to deal with the tragedy of more than 700,000 Arab refugees, talking about Palestinians. He says, in Indochina, Vietnam, we have allied ourselves to the desperate effort of a French regime to hang on to the remnants of an empire. One finds too many of our representatives toadying to the shorter aims of other Western nations, too often aligning themselves too definitively with the haves, and regarding the actions of the have-nots as not merely an effort to cure injustice, but as something sinister and subversive. Very clear statements against imperial policy. Now, he gave another speech in 1957 in the Senate, when he said that the U.S. should support the rebels in Algeria against the French. And he went after the dullest policy of turning North Africa into another Vietnam. And in his speech, he indicated that the United States policy must be for freedom for these African countries. Now, Kennedy became friends with leaders in Africa. He became an ally of Nehru from his trip to India. And I think I have one more quote. This was during the election in 1960. He said, "Call it nationalism, call it anti-colonialism. Africa is going through a revolution. Africans want a higher standard of living. 75% of the population now lives by subsistence agriculture. They want an opportunity to manage and benefit directly from the resources in, on, and under their land. The African people believe that science, technology, and education available in the modern world can overcome their struggle for existence, that their poverty, squalor, ignorance, and disease can be conquered. The balance of power is shifting into the hands of the 2/3 of the world's people who want the share that the 1/3 has taken for granted." Now, that's very powerful language. And if you think about it, how applicable is it today? What do you think the Eurasian perspective is? It's the 2/3 or more of the world's population staking a claim for their own future, free from colonial intervention, whether it's the British Empire in the 50s or the modern version of that, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the dollar-based financial system, the speculative system. Kennedy would be totally opposed to the system we have today, where a handful of speculators with money from hedge funds and shadow banking sources can go into a country and drive its currency into the ground, depriving people of food, of means of subsistence. And it's not just the poorer countries of South Asia that are targeted. We see the same thing targeting Argentina, which is a developed nation, where the vulture funds are demanding the pound of flesh. So we're looking at a world today that Kennedy was addressing 50 years ago in his policies. Now, I want to develop one other aspect of this before I get into the idea of what NASA and the space program and the moon mission represented for Kennedy. One of his other fights had to do with the Federal Reserve and the financial system, which deprived credit to industry and ended up pitting industry against labor. This is the famous case of the steel strike, U.S. Steel, in 1962, where Kennedy met with the Steelworkers Union and asked them to forego a wage increase if the steel companies would accept the idea of not increasing the price of steel. And he thought he had an agreement. Now, the steel industry at that time was heavily dominated by the Morgan family, the Morgan interests, which are British interests. And after they nodded an agreement to Kennedy's plan, they turned around a week later and raised the prices of steel. And the problem was that the Federal Reserve had a tight control on credit. There was no credit available for these companies to modernize. And so as a result, there was not only no investment, but there was no way the companies could agree to higher wages without cutting out any investment in the future. So Kennedy was trying to figure a way out of this. But he started by telling the steel companies that let me just finish, that we're not going to allow you to unilaterally dictate policies. And he used the power of government to intervene on behalf of the interests of working people and against the oligarchic interests of the Morgan family. And this is another area where Kennedy acted in a way that completely enraged the empire that he was talking about. Now, there was one other aspect of this empire at the time of Kennedy's emergence as US president. It was their fear that if he reignited this traditional American commitment to the idea that you act for the whole world by developing your nation, that you're not competing in a world of scarce resources, but you're developing new resources. And one of those most important resources is the productive power of your labor force, of each human being. This was a grave threat to an empire which required cheap labor, cheap raw materials, free trade, required a colonial-style control over finances of nations, a restriction or constriction of credit. And the idea that the United States was about to have a takeoff into a new realm of economic development, based on this idea of the government working together with its industry, with its population, to develop not just the United States, but the whole world. This was a grave threat. And what was launched at that time was what we know today as the environmental movement. The idea to take this conception that science is a universal good and reverse it by saying that science and technology are threatening the planet. And it started with a fraudulent book called The Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which misidentified the problem. Sure, there was some pollution going on. What's the solution to pollution? Upgrading your technology. Same thing with air pollution. The solution is moving to more efficient forms of energy production based on higher energy flux density. Not getting rid of the technologies that you have, but advancing them, developing them. Instead, we've reached a point where the whole argument today, where you have the man-made climate change argument, that carbon dioxide is a poison. Well, that means we're in this room right now emitting a lot of poison. We should be condemned by the EPA for breathing. Now, I'm not going to go through the condemnation of the environmental movement, just to tell you that this anti-technology view was backed up by a report by the Rand Corporation, which said that the greatest threat from the United States was that Kennedy's space program would engender a belief in the American people that the future can be made better by science and technology. And this will threaten the future. Now, I read something recently that I thought was somewhat interesting that said beginning in the late 60s, and this is just one measure of things, there was a shift in what was the subject of most science fiction. If you look at science fiction going back to the Jules Verne, what was the Jules Verne thing, the space exploration. If you look at a lot of the science fiction, it was about going out into the universe and discovering things, finding what's out there, bringing these ideas back. It was a very optimistic genre of literature. What's science fiction today? Transformers coming in and eating us, blowing everything up. The more we find, the more danger. We open up gates or windows or whatever they're called, where these creatures will come in and destroy us. So this technological pessimism, this fear of scientific discovery, this goes back to the role of Bertrand Russell, an operative of the British Empire, whose argument was that science and technology threatened the ability of the empire to subordinate the majority of the world's population to the rule of the empire. This is the British view, and has been and continues to be the British view of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip, and their doddering son, Prince Charles. So what Kennedy was taking on was the beginnings of an escalation against the American system. And it's obvious that he was assassinated, not by some disgruntled lone assassin, but by those people who were trying to protect the British Empire from this insurgency, this anti-imperial, anti-colonial insurgency led by Kennedy. Now, this brings me to the fight he had with Allen Dulles. There's a new book out called The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot, which is very interesting. It's the history of a biography, in a sense, of Allen Dulles. And it shows what a completely immoral, corrupt person this guy was. He was at the pinnacle of an aristocracy. He and his brothers were the nephews of the former Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, who was Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State. The two of them worked for Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the leading law firms of New York City, representing the interests of the largest corporate cartels. One of their clients was United Fruit Company. You know the idea of a banana republic in Central America, that we can go in and overthrow a government whenever we want to, because it's our backyard? A lot of that was done on behalf of Chiquita Banana, United Fruit Company, which was originally an organized crime operation out of New Orleans. And they own property, huge amounts of property in Guatemala, Honduras, and countries like that. And under Dulles, we overthrew a progressive government in Guatemala in 1954. Under Dulles, the CIA overthrew an anti-British, anti-imperial government in Iran, an elected democratic government under Mossadegh. Regime change, sound familiar? The same policy. Now, Dulles was one of the people who was pushing for a bigger U.S. involvement in Vietnam, but where he really tangled with Kennedy was that it was Allen Dulles who worked together with CIA networks among Cubans, anti-Castro Cubans, to organize the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place in April 1961, so 2.5 months after Kennedy was inaugurated. And Kennedy stepped into the White House, and one of the first briefings was, oh, by the way, we're invading Cuba, and you can't stop it. And Dulles said to Kennedy, if you stop this, then the word will go out among all the Cubans that you're pro-Castro, you're afraid of Castro. And Kennedy reluctantly allowed it to go ahead. But when it failed, as many of these operations do, when the rebellion that was supposed to take place, the popular uprising in Cuba against Castro, didn't take place, the Joint Chiefs and Dulles went to Kennedy and said, you have to bomb Cuba. And Kennedy said no. And shortly after that, he fired Allen Dulles. Now, this was the fight that he was waging, whether it was on the steel industry and credit policy, whether it was against wars such as Vietnam, that Kennedy did not want to expand the Vietnam War, but even more important, that he was looking to the possibility of joint space exploration with the Soviet Union. And he used the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was 1.5 years later, in October '62, which put us on the edge of nuclear war. He used that to establish back-channel discussions with Khrushchev about détente, about a test ban treaty, about moving away from the dangers of thermonuclear war. He was talking about going to open discussions with Castro as well. All of this was going on in this period after the Cuban Missile Crisis in October '62 and his assassination a little bit more than 1 year later. He made the famous speech at American University where he raised the question, don't we all breathe the same air? Don't we all have the same desire for our children? The idea that we have common interests. And it was then at the United Nations, I believe it was in September 1963, that he made a proposal for a joint collaborative effort with the Soviet Union to have a manned moon mission. And he said, why do we have to replicate what each other is doing? Why do we have to spend more money? Why not work together? And again, underlying this was this idea that through these kinds of common missions, you overcome the divisions that exist. It's very similar to a statement made, I believe it was the Chinese foreign minister, who a week ago, I believe, was in Washington, and he was talking about the potential for collaboration. And he said, we should look together through a telescope into the future, rather than into a microscope to find those things which divide us. This is the idea that's embedded now in this Eurasian perspective, which includes at its central point this idea of space exploration, of scientific development to find the most efficient forms of energy production in the form of nuclear fusion. This is the fight that we could have won in the 1960s had Kennedy not been assassinated. Now, it's in that context that we are calling on you to join us in this fight to restore a real mission to our nation. You know, the mission of this nation is not to glaze the sands of the deserts, as Ted Cruz, one of the biggest phonies on the planet, calls for. You know, Cruz is saying, I'll show you how to deal with ISIS. We're going to nuke the desert. We're not talking about the kinds of policies. You know, a lot of these guys say, well, look what Reagan did. Look at the great things Reagan did. And they ignore the most important thing Reagan did. Reagan was pursuing a détente policy with the Soviet Union. And who was one of the people he deployed to do that? Lyndon LaRouche, with the Strategic Defense Initiative. Science, advances in science. Lynn's idea of the SDI was the development of new physical principles that have a military aspect. That is, you can make, as Reagan said, nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete. But it's also a tremendous new range of economic endeavor from the scientific and technological innovation of harnessing the power of focused beams, whether it's proton beams, electron beams, laser beams, or whatever, for cutting, for measuring, for all kinds of scientific uses. This is what LaRouche put on the agenda and what Reagan responded to. Now, the issue before us then is, if you just take this short report I've given you on what Kennedy represented, and this is why, look, why was Kennedy so popular internationally? Because he offered to the world a vision of the United States as a youthful nation committed to the principles for which we fought and won World War II. A rejection of racism, a rejection of imperial policy, a rejection of geopolitics and power politics. Kennedy rejected all of that, and his view was that a strong America, strong because of its science and because of the potential productive power of its population, fears no one and can work with everyone. And this was that potential that inspired the people in my generation in the early 1960s, but which was beaten out of most of them with the emergence of the rock, sex, drug counterculture as an alternative. The idea that your own pleasure is the most important thing. Now remember Kennedy's famous statement in his inaugural address: ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. The idea that we are a part of the government. That's his version of Lincoln's government of, by, and for the people. And what do we hear today? Government is no good. Government is the problem. Who do we hear it from? A puppet of Goldman Sachs. Ted Cruz, but I could be talking about Hillary Clinton, who's the other Goldman Sachs puppet. What is Cruz? I mean, Cruz sleeps with the enemy. His wife was a top official at Goldman Sachs. Cruz claims to be against bailouts. Who got among the biggest bailouts? Goldman Sachs. Who's benefited from the post-2008 economic so-called reform? Goldman Sachs. You heard Cruz say a word about Goldman Sachs? You know, if he's running against Hillary, I assure you, no one will talk about Goldman Sachs.
Right.
Because Hillary was asked, why did you take $675,000 for private speeches from Goldman Sachs? And she said, because that's what they offered. There's a poster boy picture of corruption. If they would have offered $5 million, she would have taken it.
Yep.
And Goldman Sachs, by the way, did contribute heavily to the Clinton. And they gave $1.2 million loan to Ted Cruz for his Senate campaign. So we're dealing with a corrupt system which is bankrupt. It's not going to survive. The only thing this corrupt system can do is take us into never-ending wars, and the only thing that will end these wars is if they go nuclear. And in contrast to that, we see the dawn of a new horizon. We see the potential of what Mrs. LaRouche calls a new paradigm, centered in Eurasia, but with ideas that come from the American Revolution. And before that come from people such as Brunelleschi, universal geniuses like Kepler, like Leibniz, who were in a sense the founding fathers of our founding fathers. This is our tradition, what we're seeing unfold in Eurasia. And the problem is most Americans don't know about it because they're captivated by a discussion of penis size between little Marco and Donald Trump. So it's our responsibility to lift people above the belt, to speak to people's better selves and inspire them with these kinds of ideas. And we're seeing on a limited basis, and I say limited because there aren't enough of us yet, but we're seeing on a limited basis people respond to that. In Manhattan, where they're responding to the development of a community chorus, now 2 community choruses. We're developing that here as well. But here, we're taking the point on the fight to restore NASA. Again, not as a technological hardware operation, but as a profound transformation of the conception of what human beings can do when they're unified for a higher purpose. We don't have a candidate for president who's going to do that. Not yet, anyway. We may not have a candidate step forward. I assure you Mitt Romney is not that candidate. But we have to have that voice heard in the American population. And as Mr. LaRouche said yesterday, a minority of a population infused with ideas and inspired by this conception of mankind's potential can shift a much larger body politic. And that's what we have to do. And that's why we look at the Kennedy period, not with nostalgia, but as an idea of what's possible. And the idea of going beyond it, if we can find our own creative identities and locate that in the future. So now let me take some questions. I saw some hands going up. Let me start with John.
My goddaughter's grandfather was an executive with Bethlehem Steel. And back in 1960, his daughter told me that he and all of these executives with the steel companies that had reneged on their deal with him were routed out of bed at midnight and taken down in house arrest and forced to change their position, which they did for conflict.
Well, it wasn't quite house arrest, but they were told the president wants to see you.
That's right.
And they showed up, and Kennedy said, "You're going to rescind this deal you just made because it's against the national interest."
A lot of people look at Kennedy as having a weak hand, but believe me, he had a strong hand.
He took responsibility.
Yes.
And you see, this is what I was trying to present to you is that NASA was not an anomaly. It was not an add-on, but actually was part and parcel of a vision of what this country could be. And today, what's our vision of the United States? That we have more cell phones than people? That we have more social networking sites than people? That you have 147 friends who don't know a damn thing about you, but they like you on Facebook?
Well, there's one thing that seems to be really getting in the way of everything you're saying, and that is the status of our economy for the last 20 years and where it's driving the national debt and the standard of living for everyone.
Well, let me just, I was asked by someone the other day if I were advising a presidential candidate, what would I tell them? And I said, the first thing is look at what all the candidates have in common. They all support regime change. It's anti-American. It goes against a view of democratic government. If you don't like a government, you don't overthrow it.
Right.
I mean, you may go to war against it if they're killing people and slaughtering people and threatening to invade you. But the idea of regime change in Iraq never threatened us. Libya did, at least for the last 25, 30 years, hadn't threatened us. Assad has never threatened us. So Hillary, Trump, well, I don't know about Trump on this
Trump
one,
is not.
but Hillary, Cruz, and Rubio have all stated they support regime change in Syria. Now, secondly, free trade agreements and deregulation. Same thing, Hillary, Cruz, and Rubio are open supporters of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Hillary hedges once in a while. Cruz pretends he doesn't like a couple things about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but he's all for total free trade. Deregulation, they all say we need more deregulation.
And no government spending.
And so here you have the obvious point. We need to not only not have no regime change, but what's the positive alternative? Work with Russia, work with our allies in the region, work with China, not just to defeat terrorists, but what Kennedy said. The enemy of the Arab world, I didn't get his exact quote, the true enemy of the Arab world is poverty and want. You have these billionaire sheikhs who give nothing to the people of their country, who we've made our allies, who fund the terrorists on our behalf. Now this thing's breaking down. By the way, something that's happening in Turkey. The government is shutting down their newspapers, the truthful newspapers. And there are very large crowds demonstrating in Istanbul and Ankara against the Erdogan regime. You know, 2 journalists were accused of treason and thrown in prison because they wrote a story about how the Turkish military was aiding ISIS. And the Constitutional Court of Turkey just released them. And Erdogan attacked the Constitutional Court because he said they're doing something unconstitutional. What is unconstitutional? Letting people slander the government. So you see a totalitarian fascist regime in Turkey. Who's the biggest defender of that regime?
The U.S.
Barack Obama.
Yep.
Who's the biggest defender of the Saudis? Barack Obama and the British. The British also.
And Bush.
Well, now Qatar and Kuwait, they do a lot for their people in terms of.
Well, they do a little bit more, but they're also major supporters of terrorism and the Muslim Brotherhood. So, you know, this is what, you know, the same fight today, the fight against empire, against these corrupt corporations. It's the same fight Kennedy was waging. Betty, you had a question.
Oh, just the stupidity of, you know, just a few comments on the stupidity of the population. You know, that people get totally sucked in to these the presidential politics. We just heard from a friend of ours that was trying to organize. Oh, that the lady that is married to Cruz, who's the top official at Goldman Sachs, took a leave of absence. So therefore, you know, this has no influence over Ted Cruz.
You know, Betty,
But yeah,
oh, go ahead.
yeah, and just, you know, so people are clinging to desperately clinging to anything that they can grab at as, oh, well, he would be better than Trump.
Part of the subservience of the American people is they're not so gullible as they are delusional. They want to believe that there's some way out, that someone's going to come in and do something that'll be good. You know, the image of Reagan is the man in the white horse who rode in and saved them. You know, this is, or you know what it's also like? The person who has very little money, but every year goes to Las Vegas and gambles all their money hoping they'll hit it rich. The people who line up for Powerball lotteries. Now you create a situation where you have a handful of very wealthy people whose wealth is in every newspaper. You know, the people who, the supposedly beautiful people, the jet set, the rich people. You know all about them and their lives, or you think you do. And you're envious of that. And meanwhile, you're scraping together enough money to pay your rent each month. If you lose a job, you're maybe 3 weeks or a month away from losing your home. And what do these people look to? Well, Obama says there are more jobs, so maybe there's hope. Hope and change. Your change in your pocket is gone, and now your hope is gone. So we're in a situation where people are delusional. Now, the main reason for that is pessimism. They haven't seen anything good. They see these politicians sell them out, lie, they see their corruption. And when you tell them we can change it, they say you'll never beat them. If you got in there, they'll corrupt you. Or if you're not corruptible, they'll kill you. Look at Kennedy. People use the Kennedy example as why you can't have a change. Now, what we have to do is get people to realize that all they're doing is excusing their own failure. They're just making excuses for their own unwillingness to have an identity that is outside of the present system. The example LaRouche used yesterday is the transatlantic system is a box in which there's no living things anymore. You can't really live inside that box. And yet people are in there taking their last desperate breaths, hoping that the system somehow will survive, turn around, their stocks will go up, their lottery ticket will hit, their grandfather will die, and they'll find $10 million of gold buried in the backyard. People have all kinds of fantasies. Now, the reality is, and this is, look, I get this a lot because I do a lot of radio. People say, well, what should I do with my money? I say, you're a damn fool if that's what you're worried about. Money can disappear like that. It can be stolen. It can be bailed in. You can have a devaluation. What about gold? Well, the government can go steal your gold if they have to. If you don't have a government that represents your interests, you've got nothing. I don't care how much beef jerky you've stored and how many rounds of ammunition you have in your basement. Unless you're prepared to shoot all your neighbors, you're not going to survive. What's the basis of survival? It's thinking about something other than your survival. It's thinking about the future and the survival of the human species. And this is not a duty, a terrible thing. It's not like religion saying, well, I'd really like to go to the whorehouse, but my priest tells me I won't get to heaven if I do. So you're denying yourself pleasure by trying to be good. This is what LaRouche used to call a self-subsisting positive. You're living for a higher purpose. Your existence is a commitment to finding the means by which you can work with other people to create a better future. And that's the real essence of morality. So if you take away a functioning economy, a productive economy, and have people competing with each other over a shrinking pie, how are you different between the struggles between lions and hyenas in the desert or in the savannah? You're not. And so, we've got to say to people, there's no reason for you to be trapped as a slave. You don't have shackles on your legs. Maybe you have them on your mind, but you can get rid of them. Did you have something, Carlos? Yeah, go ahead.
I need to leave them, but I would be delighted if you take the next subject, essentially the economic side of banking.
The economic side of what?
Banking.
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 Yeah.
Yeah, well, Glass-Steagall and all that.
Yeah. Well,
I know that for next.
Sure.
Thank you.
But the point is, part of what anyone who's serious about running this country has to do is reinstall Glass-Steagall and take away wipe out the bad debt. The idea of a jubilee year. Why should we let bankers carry trillions of dollars on their books at face value that at market value are worth nothing? And yet we're giving them money so they can keep it on their books at face value. That's a fraud. So Glass-Steagall and a bankruptcy reorganization would go a long way toward getting this country in shape. Now that's something that FDR did not do, but could have done. Something Kennedy may have been moving towards. It means taking away the Federal Reserve's power to control the credit. Because the Federal Reserve is basically a front for the Wall Street banks. It has nothing to do with the US government. The government is subservient to it. So yeah, we'll talk a lot more about banking.
That's why we need Trump, because he's already done several bankruptcies. To lead the
Well, yeah, Joe.
Well, can you, we got this very sketchy update from Paul Gallagher the other day about what BlackRock, I think it is, and the operation, and that this might be Hillary's Treasury Secretary or whatever. Can you say anything about that? I mean,
No, I don't think it's so important. I mean, what you've got is various schemes to try and get out from under the bloat of debt. And there are all kinds of bad banks, good banks. There are a number of different things that have floated. I'm not really that clear on what BlackRock has proposed, but it's just another one of these schemes. And that's the problem. You don't need schemes, you need a banking system that is based on the physical economy. This is why Hamilton was so important. What Hamilton came up with was not a banking scheme for the sake of banks, but how can banks serve the general interest? And this is where, you know, the term boring banking, which is, I think, a bad term, but that's the one Elizabeth Warren and others use, that banking should be a boring business. Well, it really shouldn't. The purpose of a banker is to be able to have some foresight into where things are going to go, in a local banker in the community, where the needs are, what things have to be invested in, and then find the people with ideas that will fill those needs and make sure they have credit and work with them. As opposed to the purpose of a banker being to pad his own pocket by taking the deposits of the people who are putting their money in his bank and putting it into basically casinos, derivatives, speculative investments, mortgage-backed securities, for the sake of the bank's return. And they say, well, if the bank gets good returns, it's good for you. What happens if the bank loses? It's not good for you. And that's where we are. So the whole point is that, look, Hillary has no solutions on this, and that's why she's, the only reason she put someone like Fink in is because Larry Summers has used toilet paper. But they're going with the same approach that Larry Summers had, a monetarist approach, which is essentially fiscal policy of austerity and pumping money into the banks to keep the banking system functioning. Israel, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just curious on what's happening with the deal with the Russians and everything, because I just read a report that there's different factions, which I didn't know about. I thought it was just Syria, the government. You had a few the terrorist groups. You had Russia helping out the Syrians, but now you have several groups which they're trying to negotiate with. I just wanted to clarify on.
All right, well, as of the latest count, there are 97 so-called opposition groups that have signed on to the cessation.
Okay, wow.
Now, probably some of these groups you could fit into a New York taxi cab.
All right.
And you don't know how many millions of dollars they've received from the U.S. to form an anti-Assad group. So, you know, most of these groups have no power in themselves. They may take over a village or a part of a village, but ultimately their power came from linking up with al-Nusra.
And the general destruction and everything.
Well, but more specifically, there's a group called the Army of Conquest, which the Obama administration was saying is a legitimate opposition group that we were aiding. The Army of Conquest is largely run by al-Nusra, which is al-Qaeda in Syria. So we're on the side of al-Qaeda in Syria, and we said the Russians shouldn't bomb them. But according to the UN, al-Qaeda is a terrorist group. So the Russians were smart. The Russians said, actually Assad said this, he said, if you are willing to put down your arms, we'll give you an amnesty and you can become part of the government. And of course, the only exception to that is ISIS and al-Nusra. And so, look, the most phenomenal thing that's happened with this agreement, it's held so far, the most phenomenal thing is that Obama was completely forced to go along with what the Russians were trying to do, because the Russians exposed him. If Obama didn't support what the Russians were doing, it would be clear to everyone that he's with ISIS and al-Nusra. So to maintain a fig leaf of credibility, he had to let Kerry do the negotiations, and these negotiations took on a life of their own. Now, the only way to break this thing apart would be for Turkey to continue to do what they're doing, or for Obama to launch a provocation, whether it's in Ukraine or somewhere else. But look what's happening in Ukraine. The Europeans, Steinmeier and the French foreign minister, went into Ukraine and said to the Ukrainian government, you've got to agree to go along with Minsk too, the ceasefire agreement there. And the current government in Ukraine is weak. They have no money. They have no prospects for money. They were going to go into the European Union, and now Juncker said, you won't join the European Union for 25 years. So why did they overthrow the Yanukovych regime with the hope they were going to get into the EU? The EU played with them. And it was not the EU per se, it was NATO, British, and the United States using Ukraine as a threat against Russia. So the important thing in Syria is the truce is holding, or the ceasefire is holding. The Russians have the upper hand. And what's the point of that? Well, the whole Libya-Syria regime change was aimed at Russia. And the Russians have turned that around. Now what's on the agenda? Reconstruction. Reconciliation and reconstruction. How are you going to do that? When Europe's bankrupt and the US is bankrupt, you're going to do it through the Silk Road, through China and the BRICS. Yeah, Keisha.
I just want to make a couple of announcements. So, but John, you go ahead and ask your question.
All right, let me take your question, John.
Well, the Glass-Steagall will take the bank debt off the backs of the people, but we still have the 19, soon to be 21 trillion government debt.
Yeah.
Do you see any way for it to go away except through hyperinflation?
Well, I think the part that's being held by the Fed should be canceled, because we should shut down the Fed.
Federalize the Fed.
Yeah, let's just shut it down. We need a new bank.
How much is
national
that?
bank. But
How much is held by the Fed?
I think it's $4 trillion now.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that you reorganize it and pay it off over 20 years. You do it by putting the United States on a sound fiscal basis, which doesn't mean through cutting or raising taxes or cutting taxes. It means through investing in production.
But you pay reasonable interest over 20 years, which right now we're not paying reasonable.
Yeah, we're not paying reasonable interest at all. But you'd have to, look what Hamilton did. The model should be how Hamilton consolidated the debt and then reorganized it and then paid it off over 20 years based on the development of the United States economy. You could do that.
And he set up a protective tariff.
Well, and he also said, if you need the debt right now, we can negotiate it and give you some of that money now. But it would be better if you rolled it over, let us offer new notes, essentially, in return for us investing that and building the economy. Now, look, I want to make sure before we end that as you leave, everyone take a copy of this with you, and you can contribute as much as you want for it. But this is the proposal, the LaRouche proposal for how the U.S. will work, what we could do as in cooperation with the Silk Road policy. It's a preliminary, we call it a Hamiltonian vision for an economic renaissance, which gets right at what you're talking about. You know, the debt, as Hamilton said, could be a national blessing, provided you have the economic policies to retire the debt ultimately. Now, when you do something like this, when you create 10 million jobs in wealth-producing productive activity, you're creating new taxpayers, you're creating new potential wealth in the future. And this is the only way you get out of a debt crisis. Look, the 19 trillion really isn't that much. The bigger problem is we've got a much larger corporate debt and derivative debt and bank debt. And then you might as well add in consumer debt, because I don't know how much we have in total debt in this room. I don't know if you have maxed out your credit cards, but I'll bet you have a lot more debt than you did 15 years ago. But if you haven't maxed out your credit cards, give us some money today, because we're the ones waging this fight. But you know, the debt is used by conservatives as a way of increasing the power of the cartels, because they say we have to cut spending, cut spending. Do they ever talk about cutting the quantitative easing money going to Wall Street banks? No. Do they ever talk about cutting off big pharma or cutting off the free trade agreements that favor the cartels and add on the costs to the American people? No, they never talk about that. So it's a fraud.
Yeah, they're all.
You know, and these guys say, we gotta balance the budget. We did it in Ohio. Well, Ohio doesn't have 340 million people. People who say, North Dakota, we have a state bank and we paid everything off. How's that state bank going now that the oil prices dropped so much?
Both those last two states had oil recently too.
Yeah, Ohio and North Dakota, yeah. But now they're not so much helped by it because the oil prices collapsed and they're left with the debt.
Yeah.
So debt is the wrong issue. The real issue is credit and where the credit is going. And this is what we've got to get across to the American people. So Keisha, why don't you go ahead with your announcements?
Okay. But what I wanted to just say is, first of all, last week a lot of people in the room, some of you guys in the room, had the opportunity to participate with us or to join us in League City for the revived NASA No Limits to Growth, Mankind Must Conquer Space forum that we had with myself, Tom Weissmuller, who is a retired NASA meteorologist, and he actually also has been doing a lot of work with a group called the Right Climate Stuff, and Megan Beats from our science team. And I would say that people who had the chance to participate in that saw that there was a renewed awakening and a sense of optimism that has now come from what we've unleashed as a national campaign, what I'm leading right now in Texas with these scientific layers. And following, if you didn't get a chance to come to the event is available both on our LaRouche PAC website, and it's also up at the very top of the Schiller Institute website. And you know, it was interesting because following that event, there's been a number of meetings with some of these NASA representatives that have come out of that, luncheons and additional meetings with them. And what you're seeing right now is that you had a sense of loss of hope. It's never going to be able to come back. And now people recognize that this is the only chance of saving the United States is through the development of the space program and what it represents. And so what I wanted to say is, one, that I'm glad people participated in that. One thing I think will be very important is we have to get this message out and educate the population. That was one of the things that came about in the discussion. And a couple of things that I'm thinking of is people who go to universities maybe should think about opening up forums so we can discuss the importance of what we really should be talking about in terms of, Harley just gave a class on when leaders have vision. We have to actually be the vision. We are the vision. We're not waiting for these so-called leaders to actually come up and decide they want to present some vision, because they're not doing that right now. And so think about, you know, groups that you're in that you might want to set up meetings with, set up forums with. Think about universities that you go to, high school campuses that you go to, because I think this would be a very excellent way to really take this optimistic perspective from what the United States must once again restore in terms of what our vision, what our unified nation used to be. And obviously, what Harley just gave you, this pamphlet, and what we're doing around the world, the spectacular work that Helga LaRouche is doing. She just attended a major conference in India and on the Silk Road development. And Helga being invited here was a major development, because I mean, this was heads of states and leaders of countries from all over Southwest Asia and various other places. And if anybody has the authority to talk about the development of the U.S. and bringing this dead transatlantic system into the Eurasian perspective, it's what LaRouche and Helga has done. But on that note, what I wanted to just say is that the continuation of this land bridge policy, dumping the transatlantic bankrupt system and joining with the system of life being represented by Asia and China, Russia, and India is going to be continued in a conference on the 7th of April. And I think people here should really make plans. You know, most people spend their money trying to go to Las Vegas or anything like that. You all take vacations anyway. So this is a, I don't want to call it vacation, but it's actually something well worth doing, which is that on the 7th of April, and what we're asking people to do who actually attend this conference, there's a one-day conference so far, all day from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. And this is going to be in New York. Just to kind of give you a little rundown of what the panels will be. This is so far preliminary. The first panel is going to talk about the new Silk Road becomes the world land bridge, a grand design for the development of Southwest Asia, Silk Road, the U.S. United States recovery. Then there's going to be another panel on the new scientific frontiers, breakthroughs in thermonuclear fusion and energy, raw materials, the coming Moon and Mars mission, and humanity on the road to become a galactic species. And then the final panel of the evening is going to be on the urgent need for a cultural renaissance, a dialogue with classical cultures of the world. And people should make plans to attend that conference, also to stay. I think they're organizing for people to stay for the entire weekend. So the conference is on a Thursday all day, and you can stay for 3 days after that. There's going to be a number of activities, organizing activities.
It's like a working vacation.
Yeah, working vacation. So it should be, so I mean, this is going to be very enlightening for,
Schiller Institute.
this is the Schiller Institute conference, yes. And yeah, those who cannot attend, as Harley said, we're the only ones who are doing this, who are putting out this perspective. Contribute, sponsors somebody to go, sponsor a young person to go. You know, when there was a report that came out that there's 18,300 applicants for astronauts for NASA.
How many again?
18,300. We have to make sure that these applicants for NASA actually have a mission. They have something to do. What are they going to be doing? What does the space program actually represent now? And so that's our job, to make sure that we actually have a space program, and the space program has a national mission. And obviously, as Harley presented, we need some visionary leadership. So I want to let people know about this conference, and there is going to be more coming out on it, but start thinking about it now, booking your flights, and making sure that we have representation there.
Yeah, I just want to finish with a quote, see if you know who said this. This is someone who writes, I hope to convey how magnificent an undertaking Apollo really was, the moon mission. That going to the moon was not just a technological endeavor, but an artistic one, like Michelangelo's frescoes on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The same kind of imagination that allowed Michelangelo to produce the crowning achievement of his era helped NASA's engineers build their moonships. Just as Michelangelo needed faith in his own abilities to sustain him during his long years of his effort, so faith was at the heart of what it took to put men, their suit, shoes and socks, and pictures of their children on the surface of the moon. Above all, Apollo was a voyage of inspiration. The thing that still fuels me in my day-to-day life, and what I want to convey to my children and to the audience is, that if mankind can figure out a way to put 12 men on the moon, then honestly, we can solve anything. That's why I believe the 6 Apollo landings are 6 of the 7 greatest stories ever told. Anyone have any idea who said that?
Was it Kraft Erica?
No,
Vladimir Putin.
no.
Children.
Pope John Paul II.
Well, he said children.
Yeah.
It was Tom Hanks,
Oh,
the Hollywood actor.
Ah.
And it shows that something like that even brings out the best in Hollywood people.
Yeah, and that was a great movie, Apollo 13.
Yeah, he did
Okay,
say
yeah.
Apollo.
Yeah, Apollo 13.
Two things. There's a March 19th Senate District Convention of the Democrats. And,
We're gonna leave that to you, Betty.
no, I need resolutions, all right? And I want them now, so I can organize different Democratic clubs, send them the resolutions, I want you to bring this up, you know, and try to get people and get, you know, something on NASA, something on, you know,